Welcome to War Room, the official podcast of the U.S. Army War College online journal, graciously supported by the Army War College Foundation. Please join the conversation at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. We hope you enjoy the program.
Make sure not to miss a single podcast and subscribe to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast, at iTunes, Google Play, or your favorite subscription service. The views expressed in this presentation are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect those of the U.S. Army War College, U.S. Army, or Department of Defense. Welcome to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast. I'm Buck Haberichter, Managing Editor of the War Room and your host today. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Many of us in military and government service have traveled the world representing our nation, but it's a relatively small number that can say they made it to the top and the bottom of the world. That's just what Dr. Michele Devlin has recently accomplished. Michele Devlin is Professor of Environmental Security at the U.S. Army War College and Professor of Arctic Health and Human Security with the National Science Foundation's UNI Arctic Center. She is a Doctor of Public Health, registered nurse, and emergency medical technician. Dr. Devlin's primary specialty areas include the circumpolar humane terrain of the high north, environmental migrants, civil military responses to climate disasters, indigenous populations, and cross-cultural engagement with diverse and underserved populations. Those qualifications make her the perfect person to travel to Antarctica, and she took us along for the ride. Armed with a list of questions and her trusty iPhone, Michele recorded her thoughts, her responses, and impressions as she traveled to the Antarctic continent. Michele, welcome back to A Better Peace. So much of your work has been focused on the North and the Arctic region. Why are you going to Antarctica, and why do we care about Antarctica from a national security standpoint?
It's important to understand that the polar regions of the world, both the North and South Pole, are changing very quickly as the planet warms. And as different areas of the polar regions melt, it presents new security challenges to us as Americans and for other countries as well. So to give you an example, the North Pole is warming 4 times faster than any other region on Earth with climate change. And the South Pole is also very close to that. On general, on average, it's warming about 3 times faster than anywhere else on Earth, other than up north. And this is creating all kinds of challenges as well as opportunities that we're seeing around the world. So, for instance, if you look at the North Pole, the circumpolar world up there, we believe that that part of the world contains approximately 15% potentially of the world's oil supply, 30% of the world's gas supply, and a significant amount of the world's rare earth minerals that will be needed, frankly, for a green, sustainable revolution in energy. We anticipate that there are similar resources, richness of resources in the South Pole as well.
So despite its remoteness, Antarctica is still very closely tied with the global economy and the search for global resources.
So essentially what we're seeing is that climate change is almost creating a new gold rush, if you think of that as the analogy for both the North Pole and the South Pole. We're seeing increased economic interest, increased scientific activity, business activity and development, both in the North Pole and the South Pole. Our competitors, the Russians as well as the Chinese, are very active already and have been for some time in the North Pole as well as in the South Pole. For instance, when you talk about Chinese and their interest in the polar regions, they really do talk about both the North and South Pole together. They don't necessarily distinguish between the Arctic and the Antarctic region. But they view both of these areas of the world as increasingly important strategically, politically, economically, as we experience climate change on the planet as these regions warm. They become much more accessible to our competitors, and they are, of great political interest to a number of different countries.
You've stated before that most of your national security studies have focused on the North and the Arctic region. How will this trip impact the courses you teach at the War College and future studies of national security?
So it's very important for us to remain strategically competitive and to gain a greater understanding, certainly of what's happening in the Arctic region, but also in the Antarctic area as well. So that's certainly a major reason why I am down here in this part of the world right now. I'm actually a professor of environmental security. I study a lot about how the environment itself impacts us and what we need to know about it and how that plays out from a peace and stability and conflict standpoint. And I actually will be teaching on both Arctic and Antarctic issues from an environmental security standpoint in a few more months at the Army War College. So I think it's just very important for me to be here and to see a lot of these issues and to understand them firsthand. I did live up in the North Polar region, up in Barrow, Alaska, Utqiagvik, Alaska, on the North Slope, and returned from there about half a year ago before joining the War College. And there is nothing quite like living in a polar region in order to understand it. I call it part of the gaining tundra cred, I guess, street cred. And when you do polar studies and environmental studies, it's one thing to read about it, it's one thing to get it conceptually, but there is nothing quite like being on the ground and actually seeing for yourself and experiencing environments with extreme cold conditions. It was just so incredibly different. It was mind-boggling at times and really mind-blowing and again, fascinating to experience firsthand and to learn from different populations like the indigenous groups and climate migrants and other newcomers that live up north in the circumpolar world. So I'm equally curious about experiencing the South Pole and going to Antarctica. It's just, it's unbelievable. I'm really excited to leave here and to embark in just a few more hours. I hope I survive all the nausea on the the ship for a few days by the time I get there. But anyway, really looking forward to it and trying to understand a lot of these environmental security issues firsthand.
So is this trip going to be all business, or is there actually time for leisure while you're there on the ice?
One of the main reasons I'm traveling to Antarctica is that I am obsessed with adventure travel, quite frankly, and I've done a lot of different medical missions and global travel, like I'm sure many of our listeners all over the world, many different continents and countries. For most of us that do adventure travel, Antarctica remains the crown jewel, the elusive continent that is so hard to get to. Of course, with ecotourism today and with climate change, frankly, a lot of these more remote areas of the world are becoming more accessible to travelers. And so we are definitely seeing an increase in tourists going to Antarctica and to people involved in study tours. These are typically not for the faint of heart. You literally are going on a study tour to better understand the continent. And like many people, I'm sure, going to Antarctica, we are fans of a lot of the golden age of polar explorers. One of my favorite was Ernest Shackleton, of course, like many other folks. And he had a famous advertisement that he supposedly wrote to get people to go on one of his expeditions roughly 100 years ago, as the story goes. And that advertisement reads, "Men wanted for hazardous journey, low wages, bitter cold, long hours of complete darkness, safe return, doubtful, but honor and recognition in event of success."
That is either the worst marketing plan ever or possibly brilliant. What sort of response rate did he have to that?
Shackleton apparently had more than 5,000 people apply to be part of his Antarctica expedition when he apparently put that advertisement into a local paper in Great Britain, and including a number of women as well that applied for that. So even back then, many people with a great sense of joie de vivre and adventure and wanting to get out there and do something that really challenges them from a travel standpoint. So one of my favorite quotations attributed to Ernest Shackleton, if indeed he did write that. But I think a lot of us, again, are motivated to travel and do adventure travel by that incredible sense of wonder and excitement that we get going into remote areas that are rarely seen by other humans. So I'm very, very excited to go. In fact, I just ran into here by the harbor in Ushuaia a group of environmental ecotourists, basically, that returned from Antarctica. They were down there for several weeks, and I swear they kind of look like, if you've seen the movie The Ten Commandments, and Charlton Heston, where he plays Moses, and he comes down from Mount Sinai after seeing God, and he has just sort of this glow about him, and he's just can barely speak. He's just beside himself. So I'm not kidding. That is how a number of these visitors to Antarctica looked. Right now, when I ran into them, they could barely speak. They were just beside themselves with excitement and I think feelings of accomplishment that they finally were able to get to Antarctica, this incredibly remote region of the world. They were able to see it and experience it. They had difficulty putting into words what it meant to them. It was so transformative and so magnificent. And it was just really, really exciting to see people like that had just returned from the ice. So again, I'm really looking forward to getting there in a few days, and I can't wait myself. So we shall see.
So, Michele, you mentioned Ushuaia. Why don't you go ahead and explain what has been your route of travel up to this point, and what will it be going forward as you continue on down to Antarctica?
Well, it's an interesting journey. Certainly it's easier today than it was 100 or more years ago during the Great Polar Expedition time, but it's still a long, long, long way from home. So if you are in the War College area in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, you're probably going to be flying out of the East Coast, maybe somewhere like Kennedy Airport down to Miami. From Miami, connecting into Buenos Aires, and then from Buenos Aires connecting down literally to Fin del Mundo, the end of the world, end of the earth, to Ushuaia. And it's the big embarkation area if you're going to Antarctica by ship, which is how most visitors and tourists basically get to Antarctica today. And Ushuaia, of course, is at the very end, very bottom of South America. In Argentina, it's in the Patagonia region in Tierra del Fuego. And it's absolutely beautiful. If any of you have been to somewhere like Seward, Alaska, way up north, it almost has that same look and feel to it. There's a beautiful harbor, beautiful bay area, and then you're surrounded by magnificent mountains. And of course, we're at the end of the Andes here, and so you've got these very, very tall Andean peaks, some of them still snow-covered even in the summer, and it's the opposite time of the year, of course. So winter in Carlisle is summer down in South America. And then the town itself of Ushuaia looks almost very European. A number of their homes look almost like chalets. You do have a large former influx of people from parts of Europe, like Germany and Wales and other areas that live in this part of the country. And so it's fascinating. It has a very, like much of Argentina, it has a very European feel to it, but very Latin American feel, and thus is uniquely Argentinian and really incredible. And then people, as I mentioned, if you're here to get to Antarctica via ship, more than likely this is where you're going to be leaving from. If you are going to McMurdo Station on a different part of Antarctica, maybe you're a National Science Foundation researcher, potentially you're going as a research team, you're probably going to be flying out of somewhere like New Zealand potentially on a military aircraft or official types of aircraft. But again, if you are, here is part of a study tour, a study expedition to get down to Antarctica, you're probably leaving from Ushuaia, and it takes approximately 3 days by boat, by ship, to get to the Antarctic Peninsula through the infamous Drake Passage, probably the world's roughest part of ocean where the Pacific and the Atlantic meet and churn. So very, very rough area. And then here in Ushuaia, again at the bottom end is South America, where Chile and Argentina are. It's in Argentina. It's really an archipelago. There are many beautiful islands here with penguins on them, and you're going through, for instance, the Beagle Channel where Darwin went, and many famous explorers, of course, were all over this region. Shackleton and many others, of course, for South Polar explorations were in this part of the world and these waters right here. So absolutely fascinating place and very, very exciting to be here.
Shortly after this, Michele actually boarded the ship that would take her further on her journey. She included several different briefings that she was privy to, and we aren't able to include those in this episode for time purposes, but they will be available to the listeners on our webpage for this episode, where you can also find the notes for this podcast. We pick up again with her when she's on board the ship, and she talks about some of the preparation that had to be made, because this is a difficult journey across Drake's Passage.
Well, it's 1800, and we have now embarked leaving Ushuaia and headed towards Antarctica. We've already had briefings on how to wear the special life vests and then the special suits, the rubber suits that we would wear in the event of people falling overboard or some type of emergency. We've been taken outside our muster stations and shown the vessels, portable mobile vessels that we would be in the event of the ship capsizing. So it's all actually been very helpful. There's several Canadian Coast Guard folks here helping out as staff as well as crew, and about 130 very eager, very chatty, very talkative and excited eco tourists headed towards Antarctica. Range of ages, different countries, different cultures, men and women, all very excited. The big motivator here, frankly, for most people, continent number 7. These are heavy-duty adventure travelers, and they all want to hit continent number 7, Antarctica, the elusive land.
So very fortunately, their trip through Drake's Passage was rather uneventful. And the next time Michele thought to pick up and record again was as they were arriving on the continent of Antarctica. So with that, Michele, can you give us your first impressions as you are stepping onto land there in the most remote continent in the world?
Well, this is absolutely amazing. I think we are all still in shock, but we have gone through the Drake Passage and gotten into Antarctica and the Antarctica region, and we're here at South Shetland Island, and we have made land. And so we took Zodiacs across from the larger ship and then are now on land. And I think a lot of us, including me, we had tears in our eyes. It's actually kind of hard to describe the feeling, and people are really buoyant, but I think very reflective. It's a spiritual experience, I think, and a very sacred experience, I think, to be here so far away in a region that has been, so poorly misunderstood. And it's incredible. I'm on a gray, rocky beach. There are penguins. Penguins are adorable, too numerous to count, different kinds, chin straps and gentoos and others, and they're surrounding us and came out when we came up and are just very curious about who we are. There are large seals, sea lions. We've already seen a number of whale in the waters around us, and all these animals, basically, because they've not been exposed very much to humans before in a negative way, they trust us. And so although we're mandated to stay, 15 feet away from these animals, they come right up to us to see who we are and to literally to visit. It's actually incredible. So it's just amazing. I'm actually speechless. I feel like I'm babbling, but it's amazing. I'm so grateful to be here.
It's obviously an emotional event for you. Beyond your adoring penguin fans that have gathered around you, can you give us a little more of the visuals of what it is you see there?
So I am overwhelmed. I really get overwhelmed with, different things in nature, but Antarctica is beyond belief. I actually, again, I'm having trouble speaking about it and putting my feelings and observations into words. I would call it magnificent, pristine, sacred, huge, just fundamentally massive in size. And because humans, have not been on the continent, it's such an honor to be here and to be able to see it and to see these different creatures that live here. And it's just very, very old and ancient, and just an amazing experience. This is summer right now for them, so you do see actually a lot of barren rock, some soil. You do see a little bit of moss, growth, those types of things. But there is still a lot of snow and ice on many of the mountains. But we have been today to several glaciers that are very much melting very quickly, unfortunately. And in fact, for the past 2 days being here, we have had rain instead of snow. And the temperature right now is only about 38 degrees. So relatively warm for this part of the world where that's unusual. And so you've got runoff and water melting and running into the nest of the penguin chicks. They're exposed to very icy water. But anyway, it's absolutely incredible. There are a lot of icebergs out in all the harbors and the bays here that you can see. They are massive in size. But of course, we're getting more of them as they break off, as the climate warms, and they break off from their source and then go floating around in the area. So the presence of icebergs is very significant here. And Antarctica is full of sights and sounds and smells. I think anyone interested in doing polar security should be here on the ground and understanding it firsthand. You become one with the wildlife here. You become one with the terrain itself, and the sights are overwhelming. It's literally magnificent. I think it's probably the most incredibly beautiful place I've been on Earth, and I've traveled to about 70 different countries, and this region of the world tops anything I've seen anywhere else on Earth in terms of sheer beauty and the emptiness of it. And you don't come here to find yourself. You get lost here. Which is what people often do when they travel here. It really is humbling, I guess. Again, I'm just having trouble speaking because it's so overwhelming. It's absolutely amazing.
Here's a silly question. What does Antarctica smell like?
It does smell. We talk about sense of smell. You have a lot of guano, or the droppings of penguins and other animals. You have entire penguin highways in the ice and snow where they walk. We don't, but they do. And that's their area. It's definitely a marine environment where we are, so the waves are splashing all the time, and little and big icebergs are bouncing in the ice, and that's phenomenal to see. It's just like one big white crystal continent. And the wind, you change weather here every few minutes. I think initially on our first day we were out for 2 hours, and I think we had 6 different kinds of weather that were going on. Heavy fog, heavy mist, rain, sleet, things would lift, sunshine, just very amazing change in how the weather presents itself constantly. But a lot of penguin colonies all over. They are all over, as well as the skuas and the other birds that try to eat the baby eggs and, catch smaller penguins and that kind of thing. So there's always a lot of wildlife drama. Many, many, many seals, sea lions. We saw killer whales just a little bit ago. And so it's really amazing. But the sounds are incredible. In the background, you typically will hear a lot of the waves crashing of the Southern Ocean. And then the nonstop chatter of the penguins is very, very cool. But it overwhelms your senses. It's so off the grid, literally, literally the ends of the earth. And it's amazing to see this entire continent. There's a whole nother part of the earth that we really need to be paying attention to, especially with climate change and what that's doing in terms of melting and damage to the broader global environment.
So, Michele, I think this is a great place to pause part one of this episode. But before I let you go, I'd like to ask one last question of you. You've done a lot of work up in the U.S. high north, and you've lived above the Arctic Circle and worked with indigenous populations up in northern Alaska, up on the North Slope in the American Arctic. How do you compare the American Arctic to Antarctica and the South Pole?
Well, there are definitely differences between both, and it's a great question. I would say in terms of similarities to start with, they are both extreme areas to live. You're looking at extreme cold environments, very difficult, very challenging from an isolation standpoint and supplies and logistics, and very, very remote. But Antarctica itself is huge. It's a continent surrounded by multiple oceans, right? But the Arctic is a sea fundamentally surrounded by land, surrounded by, for instance, the Arctic 8 nations. So that's the most fundamental of all differences, even though they're linked by their extreme cold environments. The other thing would be that within Antarctica, I believe there have been temperatures recorded that are as low as minus 90, minus 100, minus 10, minus 120. It's extremely, extremely brutal, extremely cold for that. And you tend to see those temperatures more on the inside of the continent rather in some of the outer areas. And remember, it's huge. Antarctica is 1.5 times the size of the United States. And in fact, in its late winter, when you add on the ice sheets, that size of Antarctica really doubles. So it's absolutely massive. Whereas, in the U.S. high north, and you're looking basically at the North Slope Borough, Northwest Slope Borough, Nome area, very large, but nothing compared to the size of Antarctica as an entire continent. It can also, we talked about colder, Antarctica is actually also the windiest continent on Earth, and heavy winds can be just brutal here and come up very quickly and last many days, many weeks sometimes at a time. So very significant. And then one similarity actually the Arctic and Antarctica have is that they are both deserts. And that often surprises people because, we think of the snow and the white and, they must be getting snow all the time. But in reality, the Arctic up north and then Antarctica down south are actually the, world's largest deserts. A lot of the snow you see just keeps, blowing around. And I believe I'd read, too, that there are some areas in Antarctica that are so dry, they actually have not had any kind of precipitation in hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. It's that dry. Antarctica also is very mountainous, whereas the Arctic, the American Arctic anyway, is relatively flat, again, as tundra. And these very tall mountains are, some of them could be, 4,800, 5,000 meters, somewhere that range, roughly 14, 15,000 feet. So very, very tall, mountainous, rugged in parts of the continent. Like the Arctic and Antarctica, their coastlines even today remain poorly mapped and poorly explored. And the biggest difference you see, too, of course, is that the northern circumpolar region is inhabited. It's been inhabited by humans for, millennia, thousands of years. The Inupiat and many other groups that have basically circled around the pole, many, many different indigenous populations live in the northern polar region. You've got over 90 languages, for instance, native languages, let alone people and others that come up there to work. Antarctica, of course, is not a country. It's a continent. It does not have a government. It does not have indigenous populations that live there. None of that type of thing. You don't have residents, a legal resident. Now, there are a number of countries that would like to claim that potentially in the future and to change that. And that's why you see a number of nations trying to stake land claims somehow and a scientific presence basically on the continent of Antarctica in hopes of in the future maybe potentially being to have a legal share of that land. That all depends how well that Antarctic treaty holds up by the middle of about another 25 years or so from now. And then from a most popular standpoint, of course, the Arctic has the polar bears, Antarctica has the penguins. So nor will you see either in either region. So they're definitely unique. There is a tremendous amount of diversity in the humans, in the ecosystems, the politics, the physical terrain of these polar regions that we really need to, try to understand here and better appreciate. And again, as these regions warm over the decades through climate change and overall global warming, it opens up both polar regions to serious competition from a number of powers, certainly including us, the Chinese, Russia's, and other, who would, have their eyes on these areas.
Thanks again to Dr. Michele Devlin for taking us along on this incredible trip. We look forward to hearing more of her adventures in part 2 of this episode. And thanks to all of you for listening in. Please send us your comments on this episode and send us suggestions for future episodes. Please subscribe to A Better Piece on your podcatcher of choice and rate and review this podcast, because that's how more people can hear about us, so that we can continue to grow this community for conversations like this one. This conversation is over, but we look forward to welcoming you again. Until next time, from the War Room, I'm Buck Haberichter.
And that concludes our program. Thank you for listening. The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or positions of the U.S. Army or the Department of Defense. Let us know what you think. Provide us your feedback, comments, or suggestions through our webpage at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. And have a great day.